Hello and welcome back to those of you that have been following us all along, and welcome to those of you that are joining us for the first time. I'm Charles Merritt, and this is episode 9 of the Fresh Catholic Bible Study series, where in this particular series we're going through the Gospel of Mark. As I said, episode 9, we're going to be doing the second half of chapter 6. And if you're doing the math and you're saying, wait a second, episode 9, second half of 6, isn't it one of these deals where you do a chapter per episode? And ideally that's the case, and the great majority of the time that will be the case. But every once in a while you get a chapter, because either due to its length or due to the number of events in the chapter or the depth of those events. Every once in a while there'll be a chapter that, to do it justice, which is what we want to do here, is we have to spread it across 2 episodes. We saw that in chapter 1, where we did the prologue of chapter 1 in one episode, then the rest of chapter 1 in the second. We're in the midst of it again here, where last episode, episode 8, we did the first half of chapter 6. This episode 9, we'll do the second half of chapter 6. We'll see it again when we get toward the end of the gospel, and Mark records Jesus' passion and death, and obviously because that's a lot of depth there and a lot of things going on, a couple of those chapters will probably be spread over 2 episodes. But by and large, what we try and do is a chapter per episode with a few exceptions, and we just happen to be in the middle of our second one. So again, let's catch our bearings. We're going to be in the second half of chapter 6. In the second half of chapter 6, and the reason we gave it its own episode is it includes 2 huge miracles. Now, every miracle Jesus performed is huge, obviously, but in terms of notoriety, maybe in terms of the publicity they get, in terms of the familiarity people have with them, these are 2 of the bigger ones. Because the first one we'll be unpacking is the feeding of the 5,000, otherwise known as the multiplication of the loaves and fish. And then the other miracle is Jesus walking on the water. So the feeding of the 5,000, walking on the water, those are 2 events that comprise the second half of chapter 6. And because of the nature of them, we're giving them their own particular episode. Before we dive back in to chapter 6, again, a couple of things. I trust we have all our Bibles in front of us because this is a Bible study. And remember the Bible study principles, 2 big ones: context, 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 and read and listen closely because words have meaning. And when you're doing one of the hallmarks of a good Bible study is, does the presenter put the events in their context, their historical context, their cultural context, even their geographic and locational context? Because like with anything, to properly and fully understand something, you have to understand it within its context. That's why we always kind of hammer away at context, context, context. You know the saying in real estate, it's location, location, location. Well, in Bible study, it's context, context, context. And the reason I remind ourselves of that is we're going to place both of these events, as we do every event, in their proper context. So, Bible at hand, context ready, reading and listening, and since this is filmed, watching closely, let's dive back into chapter 6 and look at the first of the 2 events, the feeding of the 5,000, otherwise known as the multiplication of the loaves and fish. Now, one more thing I should probably mention before we dive in, and that is that this particular miracle is recorded in all 4 Gospels, and is the case when multiple Gospels record the same event. They record the same event, yes, but they do it from different angles and different perspectives, okay? Well, with all 4 Gospels recording the multiplication of the loaves and fish, each Gospel kind of records a different angle or perspective. Each one highlights different details and puts the emphasis in different places. Now, of the 4 Gospels, the Gospel of Mark is the most in-depth treatment of it, because not only the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is the most in-depth treatment of it, not only the treatment of the miracle of the loaves and fishes, but John follows that up with Jesus' famous bread of life discourse. So clearly, in the Gospel of John, as with the other Gospels, but in the Gospel of John, this particular miracle has very heavy Eucharistic overtones. It foreshadows, it prefigures the Eucharist. It looks backward to the manna in the desert. It looks forward to Jesus instituting the sacrament of the Eucharist. And because the Gospel of John provides us with some details that Mark doesn't, what I'm going to do is, as we go through Mark's recording of it, which is relatively short in line with him being the shortest gospel, I'm going to pull from the Gospel of John just a few extra details to really kind of round out our understanding of exactly what kind of miracle this is and how it did have very, very heavy Eucharistic overtones. So I think I've covered all the preliminary remarks I want to make, so time is ticking away. Let's dig in. Here's how Mark starts us off. He says, when he landed, Jesus saw a large crowd and had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Let's hit that pause button right away. When they had landed. Now, remember, this is 1st century A.D., right? It's not like Jesus and the disciples are traveling by private jet. They don't have a charter. When they landed on shore. They've been crossing the Sea of Galilee. Now they're back on shore, okay? And they're back in Jewish territory. And as usual, anytime Jesus goes someplace, there's large crowds either following him or there to greet him. Now, this is chapter 6 of Mark. Mark has 16 chapters. So arguably now, Jesus' popularity as far as gathering a following is starting to get at its peak. Jesus is very, very, very popular. Now, that is going to cause the Jewish religious leaders to get more and more and more worried on the one hand. And on the other hand, yes, Jesus is gaining followers. Okay, the crowds are getting larger and larger and larger. And one of the things I'll bring in from John's gospel is going to tell us that even though the crowds are large, and Mark indicates that right here, they're large for a number of different reasons. Some of the people are or will become followers of Jesus. Other people are just fans of Jesus, okay? They're following him because he's performing miracles. He's very charismatic. So you've got followers and then you've got fans. And something John says in his gospel really indicates that to us. So I'm going to pull that in because that's going to be important as we continue working through the Gospel of Mark and working through Jesus' public ministry. So he lands on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Large crowd is there. What's Jesus' reaction? He has compassion on them. Why? Because because they were like sheep without a shepherd, right? And here's where I hit the pause button, right? He had compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, you good Catholics, with you good Catholic memories, this should be ringing some more of those good Catholic bells. Let's think for a second. Sheep without a shepherd. Sheep and shepherd. Where have I heard that combination before? Oh yeah, one of the Psalms. The very famous Psalm 23, the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. Okay? The reason I hit the pause button and bring that up here is keep that in the back of your mind. Psalm 23 is going to be in the background of this miracle, all right? So he has compassion on them because they're like sheep without a shepherd. And what does he do? He begins to teach them many things. So before he feeds them, before he performs the miracle, he teaches them. All right, so let's read on. Now, when the day was far spent, so he's been teaching them a good part of the day. We don't know how long, but he's been teaching them during the day. Now it's getting to be late afternoon. Arguably, it's getting to be evening time, right? And his disciples say, this is a desert place or a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send them away so that they may go to the farms and villages round about and buy themselves food to eat. So it's getting late in the day. It's starting to become kind of, dusk. It's going to be nightfall pretty soon. And the disciples are a little bit worried. They're saying it's night's coming. Better dismiss the crowds so they can go and get themselves something to eat. All right. Now, on the surface, very legitimate concern on the disciples' part, okay? How does Jesus respond to this seemingly very legitimate concern? He says, you yourselves give them some food. And then he said to them, let me stop there. You yourselves give them food, okay? Now, in the Gospel of John, we might say, well, okay, they're concerned, it's getting late, they haven't eaten all day, it's a deserted place, dismiss them before it gets too dark so they can go and buy themselves some food. Legitimate, very valid concern on the disciples' part, and a legitimate, valid request on their part as well. So how does Jesus respond? Again, a lot of times Jesus responds to our ears in a kind of a curious manner. But once we kind of unpack his response, it gets less curious. Jesus says, you yourselves give them something to eat. Now, in the Gospel of John, John indicates to us why Jesus responded this way. Because he was testing them. He was testing his disciples, okay? So even though Mark doesn't give us that kind of insight, and without that insight, you might say, well, that's kind of a curious, maybe even a cold type of remark by Jesus. Once we bring in that detail from John, it starts to make a little bit more sense for us. Jesus is saying this to his disciples to test them. Now, what he's testing them about and what the nature of the test is and why he's giving them this test, we'll find out as we work our way through the miracle, okay? Now, how did the disciples respond to Jesus' response? They say, are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them to eat? Now, 200 denarii worth of bread. Now, a denarius, back in the first century, a denarius equaled a day's wages. So if you worked an 8, 10, 12-hour day, whatever it was, if you were a common laborer back in first century, your daily wage was a denarius, the plural being denarii. So when the disciples say, it's going to take 200 denarii to feed these people, we interpret that, we hear that to mean it's going to take 200 days' wages. It's going to take 2/3 of a common laborer's annual salary. Now, to put that into context, think of how much each of us makes yearly. Think of our annual income, right? And take 2/3 of that roughly, and that's the amount of food that would have to be bought to feed these people. Because we know the amount of the people. There are 5,000. But that doesn't even tell the story. Because back then, when you counted it, because back then, first century, it was a very patriarchal society. It was, in every sense of the word, a man's world, okay? Women, they were thought of on a lesser level, and children on an even lesser level than that, okay? So back then, when you counted a crowd, you counted just the men. So when this says the feeding of the 5,000, that's 5,000 men, not including women and children. And the other Gospels make mention of that. So in point of fact, there are probably more than 5,000 people. So 2/3 of your annual salary to buy enough bread to feed over 5,000 people, okay? So the disciples, when Jesus says, you give them something to eat, you buy them the bread, they're incredulous. They're thinking, are you kidding me? It's going to take 200 days' wages, 2/3 of an annual salary, just to buy enough bread, okay, let alone anything else, okay? So they respond in a very incredulous manner, all right? Now again, this is part of Jesus testing him. Keep that in the background. Behind the dialogue between Jesus and the disciples at this point, we got to remember this is all a test Jesus is giving them. Let's continue on, okay? Jesus responds to their incredulity. He says, well, okay, go and see how much you have, okay? In other words, see if there's any food. The disciples come back and they say, yes, we found 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now again, let's temporarily jump out of Mark, jump into the Gospel of John, and we know that when the disciples tried to figure out how much food they had on hand, we know that the 5 loaves and the 2 fish came from one small boy, one young boy. So when Mark says, yes, they come back and they say, we found 5 loaves and 2 fish, John tells us where those 5 loaves and 2 fish came from. They came from this young boy, this small boy. So they got 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, here's another detail we'll pull in at this point that kind of Mark doesn't mention, and that is, well, the loaves and the fish. Now, again, when we think of loaves and fish, if you go to the grocery store, your local Vons or Ralph's or Trader Joe's, right, you think of a loaf of bread, right? And fish, you think of maybe like an entire fish. Like if you go to the counters and they have the fish there with the head and the eye still on it. So you're looking at a loaf of bread and a fish. Back then, a loaf, when they said loaves, those were more like dinner rolls, okay? So when you hear 5 loaves, kind of picture 5 dinner-sized rolls rather than big loaves of bread. And when you hear fish, the fish were more like sardines, not big, full-on fish. They were sardines. So, yeah, 5 loaves, 2 fish, but think of 5 kind of dinner rolls and 2 sardines. I mention this because on the one hand, look at the context. One of the signature literary techniques we've talked about that Mark has is contrasts. He likes to contrast things. Here's another signature Mark in contrast. You've got over 5,000 people, very hungry, and you've got the equivalent of 5 dinner rolls and 2 sardines. Again, keeping in mind, this is a test for the disciples, right? So they bring back the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And one other detail let's pull in to really kind of mine the ore of the background of this miracle. The loaves, Mark doesn't tell us this, but John tells us the loaves are barley loaves. Now, why the big deal? Because barley was the food, it was the bread of the poor, okay? So these people are eating barley loaves. They're eating the bread of the poor. So this is not top-of-the-line stuff here, okay? There's not much of it. It's not top-of-the-line stuff. So let's continue reading Mark's recording, okay? So they bring back the 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus is telling his disciples, he ordered them to make all the people recline in groups on the green grass. Pause button again. Get the picture. The disciples find that boy. He's got the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. They bring the 5 and 2 back to Jesus. Jesus says, okay, tell the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. You might say, okay, whatever, let's move on. Oh, hold it a second now. Hold it just 1 minute, okay? Hit that pause button. To sit down in groups on green grass. 2 important details, okay? Jesus has the disciples have them sit down in groups, indicating that Jesus being God, and we know God is a God of order. He created the universe in an orderly fashion. He does things in an orderly fashion. He's very intentional with what he does. And when Jesus says, not just have them sit down, but have them sit down in groups. Again, that reminds us that God is a God of order, God is a God of purpose, God is a God of intentionality. So that's what's lying behind that detail. And Mark indicates that the ground they sit on is green grass. Now that brings out 2 additional things that kind of richen our understanding of this miracle. The grass is green. So we're in the springtime. Now, Mark doesn't indicate this, but John's gospel tells us that the Passover was near. And the Passover, like our Easter, is in the springtime, okay? So that gives us kind of a calendar context. It's nearing the Passover, all right? And the green grass has another significance other than indicating it's spring, it's Passover time. And again, go back to something I kind of told you to tuck away in the corner of your mind at the beginning. Psalm 23. Let's bring that back into the mix. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He makes me lie down in verdant pastures. Now the people are lying down, they're sitting down in green grass. Psalm 23. This miracle has Psalm 23 written all over it, okay? Something that's sometimes not really considered or caught. So, the disciples are getting everybody organized. They're sitting down in groups on the green grass, okay? What does Mark record next, okay? And they recline the groups of hundreds and fifties. Another detail, we've got to stop and hit the pause button. Not only were these people in groups, they were in groups of hundreds and fifties, okay? Now, why is that a big deal? Well, again, let's go back to our old buddy, the Old Testament, okay? Because, again, the Israelites have been brought out of Egypt, right? They've gone through the Red Sea. They're going through the desert. They've built that temporary tabernacle, so every time they camp, they put together that tabernacle with the presence of God in it, and they camp. Once they put together that tabernacle in the desert, each place they camped, right? The tabernacle would be in the middle, and all 12 tribes would kind of camp out around them. And each tribe would sit in its own groups. Now, what is Jesus having them do? Sit in groups of hundreds and fifties. Because within each tribe, okay, there were groupings of hundreds and fifties. So this kind of has the Exodus kind of in the background as well. So this is chock full of stuff that for many of us, we had no idea it was in there. We had no idea Mark mentioned it, and we're even bringing in some things that John mentions. So this is a much richer miracle than maybe we gave it credit for, which is why I wanted to devote the better part of one episode to it, okay? Because, it brings to mind something we talked about in the previous podcast, and that is, as Catholics, we're very familiar with these events, but sometimes our familiarity is a trap for us because we're so familiar, we think we know everything about them, and we really don't consider them anything beyond the surface. And one of the things of this Bible study that hopefully is coming across is even in the most familiar events, like this is arguably, there's so much behind the surface, okay? So let's not let our Catholic familiarity cause us not to mine the richness of each of these events. So let's move on, okay? Because kind of the plot is thickening. And remember, behind all of this, Jesus is testing his disciples. He's not just feeding over 5,000 people, he's testing his disciples. So let's move on. So the disciples have them sit down in groups of hundreds and fifties on the green grass, okay? And now Jesus has the loaves and the fish, right? And what does he do? Let's read how Mark records this. And he, Jesus, took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, number 1, looking up to heaven, number 2, blessed them, number 3, broke them, and number 4, gave them to his disciples to distribute to the crowd, okay? Looked up to heaven, blessed, broke, and gave. Now let me hit the pause button here, okay? Because if we move forward in time to the end of Jesus' ministry, and we enter a Holy Week, specifically a Holy Thursday night, and we take a peek into that upper room on Holy Thursday night, we know one of the things that's happening is Jesus is having the Last Supper with his disciples. And it's within the context of that he institutes the Eucharist. And if you take a look at how that's recorded, for both the bread and the wine, okay, the bread specifically, because that's what's mentioned here, he does what? He blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it to his disciples. He does the same 3 things on Holy Thursday night in the upper room during the Last Supper that he's doing here to these 5,000 people, okay? So not only does this look back to the Exodus, okay, it looks forward to Holy Thursday night, the upper room, and the Last Supper, okay? So he does that. He gives it to his disciples to distribute. All right. So they're going among the crowds. They're distributing the bread and the fish. Right. Now keep in mind, right? He blessed and broke and gave to his disciples 5 dinner-sized rolls and 2 sardine-sized fish. Now the disciples are taking that. They're going into this thick crowd of over 5,000 people, and they're handing out bread and fish to all of them, okay? Again, keep in mind, this is a test, right? So they're going out, they're distributing it to the people, right? And then Mark says, all the people ate and were satisfied. Hit that pause button again, because let's not wash over that too quickly. Over 5,000 people not only ate, but they were satisfied. They were completely filled up. So it wasn't like, well, there was only enough for each person to get like a little crumb of bread and a little piece of fish. No, these were multiplied to such an extent that over 5,000 people ate their fill to the point where they were fully satisfied. And think of yourself, when you're starving and you sit down for a meal, right? And you're eating and eating and eating, and you get to a point where you just kind of push away from the table and go, oh boy, I am stuffed. Bring that feeling of being stuffed to mind, because that's basically what this over 5,000 people are feeling at this point. They have eaten and they are stuffed. They are satisfied. But I bring this up for another reason. And again, let's pull Psalm 23 back into the mix again, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. They ate their fill and were satisfied. They did not want for anything more. So Psalm 23, like I mentioned a couple of times, and I know I'm being repetitive, but really it is all over this miracle. So they've eaten their fill, all right? They're totally satisfied. So Jesus has multiplied the 5 and the 2 to such an extent that over 5,000 people are now stuffed. And then, as if to say, well, just to make sure you good Catholics have a handle on how extensive this multiplication was, not only were over 5,000 people completely stuffed, there was enough left over. Well, first of all, there were leftovers, and there was enough left over to fill 12 wicker baskets. So Mark, you almost get the idea that Mark and the other gospel writers, they're taking pains to not only impress upon our minds that this was a miracle, but this was an unbelievable, stupendous miracle. Yes, it's the multiplications of the loaves and the fish, but to such a degree that it fed A, over 5,000 people, B, to the point that they were stuffed, C, to the point that there were leftovers, and D, to the point that there were enough leftovers to fill 12 wicker baskets. And how much is a wicker basket? They're pretty substantial. Okay, so there was plenty left over. All right? All right, let's dive back in here. Okay? He says, all ate and were satisfied, and they gathered up what was left over, 12 baskets full of fragments, besides what was left over of the fishes. I know I've done this quite a few times, but let's hit that trusty pause button again, because I got to stop and point out yet another detail that sometimes washes over us. Let's read that line again, okay? They gathered up all the fragments, okay, enough to fill 12 wicker baskets, right? With the fragments of what? The bread. The bread that he has just multiplied, okay? Besides what was left over of the fishes. What fishes? The fishes he just multiplied. So all of the feeding and all of the leftovers come from the original 5 loaves and 2 fish, okay? And then Mark finishes off the recording. He says, now those who had eaten were over 5,000, which I indicated included women and children, okay? Now let's circle back. That's the end of that particular miracle as recorded in the Gospel of Mark. But now let's double back to one of the first things that I mentioned, and that is that Jesus was testing his disciples, okay? And the test was, okay, you know, you've got a ton of people here. They're hungry. We've got no food. Humanly speaking, to human eyes, this looks like an impossible situation, okay? The disciples, now they've been with Jesus. This is chapter 6 of Mark. They've been with Jesus for a while. In previous podcasts, we've looked at previous miracles Jesus performed in their presence, right? So the disciples should have known at this point that even though through human eyes this looked like an impossible situation, nothing is impossible for God, and Jesus is God. So despite all human obstacles and limitations, the disciples should have known that at the end of the day, Jesus was going to have some way of feeding over 5,000 hungry people in a deserted place with no apparent food. Okay? That was the test. And the disciples kind of failed that test because when Jesus said, well, you know, you give them some food, they're talking about how much money it's going to take to buy enough food to feed the people. When they should have realized they shouldn't be worried about, you know, how much money it's going to take to buy how much food. They should have realized that Jesus is God, nothing is impossible for God, and somehow, some way, God will provide. So a teaching moment, as everything is for Jesus with his disciples, and a teaching moment within the larger context of a miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, the multiplication of loaves and fishes, okay? Interesting. So again, coming into this episode, think back now on what you knew about this miracle, and now think about how much more you know after, I'm looking at my counter here, about 30 minutes worth of explanation, okay? We brought in some details from John to richen it up. We've realized that Psalm 23 is all over it. We realize it points back to the Exodus. It points forward to the Last Supper. A lot going on, okay? And then we'll finish off chapter 6 with the final event, another miracle, Jesus walks on the water, okay? Now, Mark goes from this event, the feeding of the 5,000, to Jesus walking on the water. If we go to the Gospel of John, he tells us what happens after this event is Jesus then the next day goes into the local synagogue, and that's where he gives his bread of life discourse, where he indicates my body's real food, my blood is real drink, you have to eat my body and drink my blood, the famous bread of life discourse, okay? He gives that at the day after the feeding of the 5,000. Mark indicates that, and Mark spends a lot of his chapter talking about that discourse. Mark doesn't. Mark leaves that discourse out and goes immediately from the miracle. He kind of skips over the discourse, and now Jesus is walking on the water, okay? But in between these two events, that's when Jesus gives his famous bread of life discourse in the synagogue on the next day. So let's go back into Mark, okay? All right. Immediately afterward, he made his disciples get into the boat and cross the sea ahead of him to Bethsaida. And immediately afterwards. Now, if you're looking at Mark, you're thinking immediately afterwards of the feeding of the 5,000? No. Immediately afterwards, the next day, immediately afterwards, Jesus gave his bread of life discourse. So you've got the feeding of the 5,000. Next day, he's giving his bread of life discourse in the synagogue. And then immediately after that, that's that Mark is plugging into. Immediately after that discourse, Jesus tells his disciples, get into a boat, cross to the other side of the Sea of Galilee to Bethsaida, okay? Now, the disciples get into the boat. they put out into the Sea of Galilee. Where's Jesus and what is he doing? Is he in the boat this time with them? No. Listen to what Mark says. While he himself, Jesus, dismissed the crowd, okay? And when he had dismissed them, he went away, went up to the mountain to pray. So Jesus puts the disciples in the boat, sends them on their way across the Sea of Galilee. He goes up to a mountain to pray alone, okay? Now, Mark brings this out a little bit. Luke brings it out a lot. The Gospel of Luke really shows us that our Lord, Jesus, was a man of prayer, okay? Luke really brings that out. Mark does to a certain extent, but not nearly as much as Luke. But every once in a while, Mark will indicate Jesus went off by himself to a kind of a desolate place to pray. This is one of those occasions, right? Now, he's praying, right? The disciples, so picture the scene. Jesus is on this mountain praying. The disciples are going across the Sea of Galilee, right? They're going across the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus is watching them. And they're starting to strain at the oars, as Mark tells us. Now, why are they straining at the oars? Because a wind was against them, okay? So they're going across the Sea of Galilee, and they're going into a headwind, and it's making it hard for them to row, right? And Jesus sees this. Now, Mark drops in an interesting detail at this point. Mark says, oh, and by the way, so to speak, it's the fourth watch. Now, what you did back then is you divided the day into watches, and the fourth watch was the absolute dead of night, okay? So let's add that into our mental picture, right? Jesus is on the mountain praying. The disciples are rowing across the Sea of Galilee. They've encountered a headwind. It's getting harder to row, okay? Jesus is watching this, and the timestamp of all of this, it's in the dead of night. Now, the reason I mention that, Mark mentions that, is what he's going to record next. So let's read on, okay? Straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, about the fourth watch of the night, and he came to them walking on the sea. So at this point, Jesus goes down the mountain, and he's walking toward the boat, and he's walking on the water. He's walking on the sea, all right? And the disciples see this individual. Now remember, it's the dead of night. You're on the Sea of Galilee. It is pitch black, right? They see in the distance this figure walking toward them on the water. And what's their reaction? Mark tells us they think they see a ghost, right? They think that, this can't be a guy walking on the water. Oh, so it's got to be a ghost, okay? Again, I love these disciples because the disciples, so often I see myself in them. Mostly Peter, they put their foot in their mouths. They say the worst things in the most inopportune times. They have doubt. They have little faith. They're just like every man, right? And I see so much of myself in them, which is a good thing, because if these disciples came across as in Jesus' public ministry as superheroes who could do no wrong, they would be unrelatable. I couldn't relate to them. I'd say, oh, well, yeah, of course they believe. Look at them. They're superheroes. But they were flesh and blood. They were every man, right? They're just like you and me, with the same foibles, the same doubts, the same missteps, right? So the disciples, they have just, on top of the miracles they've already witnessed, they just witnessed Jesus multiplying enough bread and fish from 5 and 7 to feed over 5,000 people and have enough left over to fill 12 wicker baths. They've just witnessed that, right? So the fact that this could be Jesus coming to join him in the boat didn't even cross their minds. It had to be a ghost, right? I love the disciples. So anyway, they see this figure coming across the water, and they say it's got to be a ghost, right? And hang on here, I lost my spot. I'm getting so excited here. And so they say it's got to be a ghost. And Jesus responds. He says, "Take courage, it is I." I'm going to have to hit that pause button again. Another juicy detail. He tells them, don't be afraid, because they were afraid that I was a ghost, right? It's again, Sea of Galilee, it's the dead of night, it's pitch black. There's a figure walking toward them. What the heck could it be? It's a ghost. Oh, my God, we're out in the middle of the sea. What do we do, right? Jesus says, calm down, chill out, take courage, okay? And then he says, it is I, okay? Now, let's stop here and go one last time, at least for this episode, back to our buddy, the Old Testament, okay? Let's go back before Moses leads them out of Egypt, okay? Remember Moses, before he led the Israelites out of Egypt and through the Red Sea and across that desert, right? He had to find out that this was going to be his calling, right? And he found out when he was a shepherd for an individual named Jethro. And as shepherds do, they would lead their sheep, like sheep without a shepherd. We kind of began this episode with those words. He would be a shepherd, like every shepherd does. He would lead the sheep out to the field to graze and then bring them back at night. Well, on this particular day, Moses was being a shepherd for Jethro. He led the sheep out. They were in the field grazing, and you know the story. Another case of good Catholic familiarity, right? But let's not let it trap us. He's out on the field, okay? It's a day like any other until it's not, right? He spots a bush. Nothing unusual about that. The bush is burning. Not unusual about that because the desert was hot. Sometimes these bushes would catch on fire because they were very dry. But what was unusual is the bush was burning, but it wasn't being consumed by the flames, right? And we know the story. Moses goes, well, that's weird. Let me go over and take a closer look. And he goes to the closer look, and all of a sudden, a voice, which we know is God, is coming out of the bush and talking to him, saying, Moses, stop there. You're on holy ground. Take off your sandals. And that's when Moses gets his call that he's going to be the guy God uses to deliver the Israelites out of Egypt. And if we follow the story a little bit more, Moses tries every which way to get out of it, I'm not your man. Yeah, sure you got the right guy. I think you meant somebody else, right? And one of the excuses Moses gives to try and get out of this calling, okay, is he says, well, when I go, who should I tell the people sent me? When I go to the Israelites and saying, I'm here, I'm going to deliver you, I'm the person that's going to deliver you out of Egypt, if they say, well, first of all, who sent you? God, through the burning bush, says, tell them I am sent me. So that's God's self-identification. I am. Now let's take that and let's go back into this last part of this last miracle in chapter 6. Jesus responds, take courage, it is I. Kind of a derivation of I am. So Jesus is telling them, take courage, I'm God. Which, by the way, is why I was able to walk on the water, even though you thought I was a ghost. Okay? So that little detail was dropped in, all right? And after that, they were not afraid. So they did take courage like he told them to. Now let's finish off how Mark records this miracle, okay? All right? So what he does, he talks to him, says, take courage, it is I, right? He then gets into the boat. And remember that headwind that was coming at him that was so strong they could barely row the boat? Okay? He gets into listen to what Mark says, okay? And Jesus, got into the boat with them, the disciples, and the wind stopped. So the minute Jesus gets in the boat, the wind stops. He doesn't even have to rebuke the wind. He just gets into the boat and the wind stops. So kind of like a mini miracle within a larger miracle of him walking on the water, okay? What's their response to all of this, their reaction? And they were utterly besides themselves with astonishment. For they had not understood about the loaves because their heart was blinded. Now, a lot of times when we're reading this passage, okay, as soon as Jesus gets in the boat and the wind stops, we say, okay, event is over, let's move on. Well, Mark drops in one additional thing, okay? Yeah, the event is over, you good Catholic readers, but I want you to remember one thing going forward. And what is that one thing he tells us? That they were astonished, okay, but they didn't understand about the loaves because their heart was blinded. They didn't understand about the loaves. Well, we got to ask ourselves, what about the loaves did they not understand? Now, at the beginning, they thought they had to spend 200 denarii to buy enough bread, right? Then they find out that wasn't necessary. Jesus, being God, can perform a miracle. So they witnessed a miracle. So we have to say to ourselves, after witnessing this miracle, what's left for them not to understand about the loaves? Good question, right? Now, I've got two choices at this point. I could either say, well, hold that thought, and we'll find out as we progress through the rest of this Bible study. But that might be kind of cold, right? So I'll give you a little teaser on what about the loaves they might not understand. It wasn't that he couldn't perform a miracle. They obviously just witnessed it. So that's what they didn't understand about the loaves. What did they not understand about the loaves? The key to understanding this last little thing Mark tells us, the key to understanding it lies in the fragments left over. Because the feeding of the 5,000, okay, now, I know I'm kind of running over time here a little bit, but this is going to be good, so stay with me, okay? We know that there's a feeding of the 5,000, and then there's another feeding of 4,000. And there's always been a bit of confusion. Are they two separate feedings, or are they the same feeding where different gospel writers attach different numbers to them? And they're two separate feedings. The feeding of the 5,000 is one event. The feeding of the 4,000 is another. The feeding of the 5,000 is to Jewish people. The feeding of the 4,000 is to Gentiles. The reason we have the two feedings, one to Jews, one to Gentiles, is we know that Jesus came to save the Jews and the Gentiles, okay? Now, what does all of that have to do with this? Well, when Jesus multiplied enough bread and fish to feed over 5,000 people to the max, okay? And then Mark tells us there's leftovers, all right? Those leftovers, okay, is an early indication to us that Jesus came not just for the Jews, but he also came for the Gentiles, okay? He came for everybody. Salvation is for all. God wills everybody to be saved. So those fragments, those leftovers, were kind of a cryptic hint that, you know, it's not just the Jews that are going to be fed. It's also the Gentiles, because Jesus came to save both. And at this point, the disciples don't get the deeper significance of those leftovers. They'll come to get it as we go through the gospel, but at this point they don't. So that's what they don't yet understand about the loaves. They don't understand about the fragments of those loaves, indicating Jesus is not here just to feed the Jewish people. He's here to feed Gentiles as well, because he's here to save all. So now you get a real good indication, because I've gone over my time limit here, on why we gave these two miracles their own separate episode, which went over time, because there's a lot going on here, even though we're very familiar with both events. So without any further ado, I'll quit while I'm behind, so to speak. Let's wrap up episode 9, chapter 6. Thank you for watching and listening. And until episode 10, when we move into chapter 7, as we inch toward the halfway point in the Gospel of Mark. Take care, everybody, and God bless.